Coming up on Chasing the Natty, as we reach the midpoint of the season, we are all gearing up for our team's push for the playoffs, and we'll be looking to reinforce our teams with another look at the waiver wire post Week 7. As always, we'll be tackling some of the disappointing players and what to do with them moving forward. We'll talk about some of the big Week 7 performers you should avoid on the waiver wire, and then we'll get to the part you're all dying to hear about. The players you could be adding to your roster, which will help you down the line as we get closer and closer to the playoffs. We've got all of that and more coming right after this.
Look at Jinty go! Breaks a tackle! He's 10! He's touchdown! Cook's gonna throw the deep ball, and Burton past the defense! Touchdown, Luther Burton! Milrow gonna run it again, got a lane! Kicked in the turbo, Milrow! Goodbye! Touchdown, Bama!
This is Chasing the Natty, a college fantasy football podcast. All right, welcome in everyone. This is Jared Palmgren, host of the Chasing the Natty podcast. I hope you guys are having a wonderful ride to your work on this Monday morning. We are the College Fantasy Football Podcast on the Campus of Canton Podcast Network. You can find us in all of your podcast feeds and on YouTube every Monday and Wednesday morning during the season at 6 a.m. sharp. If you want to support the great work we're doing here, head on over to campuscanton.com. Subscribe there with any of our phenomenal tiers. We got content ranging on all sorts of college football games, whether it's CFF, Devy, Campus Canton Leagues, College IDP, College DFS. Really, if you play it, then we've got content, whether that's tools, rankings, pretty much everything you need to succeed. If you want to get in touch for whatever reason, you can find me in the show on Twitter. I am at CFF_Jared. The show is at Chasing the Natty. And if you guys have not already, go ahead and show us some love by leaving a like, a comment, and subscribe on the YouTube side of things. If you're on the podcast side of things, leave a 5-star review wherever you're listening and make sure you are following the show. Not only does that show us some support, but you also help out the game of college fantasy in general when you guys do that. So, all right, guys, we're officially now halfway through the college football season. Again, most teams have played 6 of their regular season games. In most leagues, you're probably looking at anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks left until we get to, your playoff matchup. So it's showtime, I guess, right? Like, again, you're at this point, if you're in a dynasty league, you're making your decisions of whether or not you're going to try to push to compete this year, or if you're going to start planning for next year kind of deal, selling off your seniors and stuff like that. If you're in a lot of leagues right now, this is kind of put up or shut up time, right? You're all, you have your guys, you have your teams that are kind of sitting at the top of your standings. Hopefully that's some of you guys, obviously, who are, 7-0 at this point. They're rocking and rolling every single week. 6-1 teams, 5-2 teams, all guys that are looking to make those pushes. But then you got those teams right there, you're 4-3, 3-4, where you're not out of it, but you got a lot of work to do in order to make sure you win out if you're going to have a chance here moving forward. So if that is the kind of stuff that you're looking for here, whether you're trying to shore up a playoff spot or if you need to really turn your team around in order to make sure you land one of those 4 or 6 spots in your leagues, you have come to the right place. This is our waiver wire show for post Week 7. As always, we will cover a variety of things here. Y'all, we'll first hit our freakout list. We got 2 names here, 2 quarterbacks that have been giving people some heartache recently that we will be talking about. 2 guys that started off decently hot in the season, have very much cooled off since then. So I have consulted myself and Nate Marquise and Chris K, and we will give you guys some ratings on those guys, on how much you should be freaking out about them. Then we'll be hitting up 5 guys on the waiver wire who are going to look pretty enticing because they scored a lot of points this past week, and I'm here to tell you, don't grab them. They are a trap. I'm not always correct, and sometimes guys keep going, but a lot of times I am able to help you guys avoid some guys who perform really well this week, and then next week they absolutely bottom out because they did some things this week that were not very sustainable. And then, of course, we'll get to the portion that you guys are all probably waiting on, the actual waiver wire pickups for this week. So without further ado, I'm rocking and rolling. I'm like right about 5 minutes in, so we'll get right on to it. Let's go ahead and hit up as soon as I can find the button. There we go. Set up our freakout list for post week 7. We got 2 quarterbacks that we'll be talking about here today. Some guys that have really been sick, one of which has been, I say that these guys have had requests every single week, and I think I've been avoiding putting them on the freakout list mostly because me personally, I'm like, they're going to hit their stride eventually, right? I mean, one of these guys was absolutely on fire to start the season and has been in a slump. The other guy, I was like, okay, like, yes, he hasn't really performed as well as we wanted to, but, we love this system. Maybe we kind of get things going, and it's just been a very big disappointment since then. Our 2 guys here are Jackson Dart and Nico Iamaleava. 2 offenses that completely killed it to start this season, right? Like, there was talk about, Ole Miss and Tennessee having these nigh unbeatable offenses. Look how many points they're putting up. I mean, Tennessee put up 71 versus Kent State, 51 versus NC State, and then now, as both of them get into SEC play, we really see that these offenses were a bit of a mirage. Now, I still think both of them are good systems. I think both of them have both the talent and the, like I said, the coaching system there to really kind of put things together if they can. But as of right now, both of these offenses have very much taken a step back in recent weeks. Ole Miss, a very good example here, right? Again, this is an offense that was breaking scoring records through the first 4 weeks, but as much as people clown on people who will sit there and say like, oh, well, they ain't played nobody, Ole Miss literally just had not played anybody. Probably the toughest competition they had was Wake Forest. And as we're seeing as the season goes along, Wake Forest's defense is atrocious. And so now Ole Miss over the last couple of weeks has really calmed down on the scoring. They're now struggling to hit 30 points in regulation against, again, not bad teams here. All right, let me be very clear here real quick. The first 2 teams that Ole Miss faced here was part of the reason why I didn't really, hop off of Jackson Dart here too much. Again, against Kentucky, 261 yards and a touchdown. He also ran the ball for 22 yards. Like, there was enough bones there. It's just, to me, it was bad touchdown luck. Like, all right, well, a lot of touchdowns were going to Henry Parrish and the like. So, and also, again, like, Kentucky's is also a really good defense. If you look at their defensive numbers here from C2C winning edge, they're 11th in the country in defensive team performance. So they've been doing really well. So I was willing to let that slide. They go against South Carolina. South Carolina also pretty solid. They're 13th in the country in defensive team performance according to C2C winning edge. And Ole Miss was able to put up 27 on them once again. Jackson Dart, no touchdowns on the day, but 44 yards on the ground and 285 yards through the air. Very much another case where I was like, okay, again, bad touchdown luck. They just had to run it in. We don't get that excuse from this past week. LSU is much further down in the defensive rankings. They're 70th in the country in team defensive performance. Their passing team defensive performance is 85th in the country. And while we still got decent production out of Dart, they just did not take advantage of that at all. Finished the day with 1 touchdown, 284 yards on 42 attempts, no less. His yards per attempt went down greatly against this LSU defense. There is, in my opinion, quite a bit to be concerned about here, and that's why I've got him at a 6. For those of you who don't remember, our freakout scale rating is a 1 to 10 scale. 10 is like drop that guy, no reason for him to still be on your roster. 1 is start with confidence. You asked me the past 2 weeks, I would have kept saying like, okay, yeah, let's do 1 to 3. I'm up to a 6 now. This Ole Miss offense just is not clicking like we saw it to start this season. And again, I was originally willing to write that off as touchdown luck with him over the past 2 weeks. Problem is, 3 games is a trend. They are not actively going out of their way to get Jackson Dart these touchdown opportunities, which is strange because based on the start of the season, it really seemed like Ole Miss was going to gun for Jackson Dart getting a Heisman campaign. I don't know if they saw the love that Travis Hunter and Ashton G&T were getting, and that told them like, oh, let's dial it back on Dart. I don't know if that's how the staff thinks about it at all, but regardless, like, it's very clear, like, Ole Miss is not putting up the points. They're not going through Dart in order to get those points. So I'm at a 6. I do think that if you have him as a quarterback, you should be looking for a backup plan. Kay and Nate are a little bit lower than me. Kay's at a 4, Nate's at a 3, and I totally get it. This is where I was the last 2 weeks as well. But again, 3 games in a row where we're looking at, 1 or less touchdowns from Dart. Very, very concerning, in my opinion. That, of course, means he's about to blow up this next upcoming game here. But as of right now, I'm a little bit more worried about Dart. I think you should target a quarterback. There are a ton of great quarterbacks on waiver wires right now. I think you should at least be going out and grabbing one of those. The other quarterback we got to talk about here is Nico Iamaleava. Is this the first time that we've ever had a solid 10? Because Nate and I are both at a 10. There's no reason for Nico to still be on your roster at this point. This is a quintessential bust in CFF. There's no other way to say it. Iamaleava had everything here. He had Josh Heupel's system. He is a 5-star quarterback. We saw him do pretty well against Iowa last year. He had great weapons across the field between Brew McCoy, Squirrel White, Dante Thornton, Chris Brazzell, all these different guys that seemed like everything was in place. He had himself even a great running back in Dylan Sampson to kind of take things off the passing game if they needed to, kind of open things up for them. Here we are, going into week 8. We got 6 games played with Iamaleava, and in the last 4 games, he has not hit 200 yards passing. He has not had more than 1 passing touchdown in a game. His last 2 fantasy games have both finished under 10 points. Iamaleava is an incredibly talented quarterback. Do not get me wrong. Do not hear me say that Iamaleava is a bust as in like a Devi potential or anything like that. But for CFF this year, it's done. I don't think there's any reason for keep him on your roster at this point. I don't know what's going on with Tennessee's offense. Ever since they hit the SEC schedule here, they've completely gotten neutered on offense. Hell, they needed overtime to beat Florida this past week. They couldn't get anything going against Arkansas. We could blame it being on the road with Arkansas, but they were at home against Florida, and they just couldn't generate anything offensively. It's done. I'm dropping Nico everywhere in leagues that I have him in for redraft purposes. Obviously, if it's a dynasty league, then I'm, he could put it all together next year. There's no issue with projecting that. But right now, I think the Iamaleava dream for this year is done. So that's our that's our freakout scale for this week. Let's move on over to some of these waiver wire traps for this week. We got some very interesting ones. Some guys that came out of absolute nowhere this week. But first, let me take a sip of water and then we'll dive right into it. All right. We'll start with the quarterback here. We got one quarterback that I want to take a look at here, and that is Evan Bullock, the quarterback out of Louisiana Tech. This is very much a mirage in every sense here. There are some bones over the last 2 weeks as a new starting quarterback for Louisiana Tech over the last 2 weeks here. And against Florida International, I actually kind of like the stat line overall. 37 passing attempts. I don't love the fact that he only got 218 yards out of it. Didn't get any touchdowns, but, bad touchdown luck. I could see there being a good path moving forward there, but then he swung in the complete opposite direction this past weekend, where against Middle Tennessee State, he passed the ball 25 times for 290 yards and 5 touchdowns. He also got another touchdown on the ground, so 6 touchdowns from Mr. Bullock here after scoring 0 in the week before. And to me, that is screaming regression candidate moving forward. I think we can definitely see a path to maybe Bullock, becoming a potential, 20-ish point per game kind of quarterback. But again, 6 touchdowns on only 25 or 5 touchdowns on 25 attempts. So that means a touchdown every 5 throws, which is completely unsustainable, and a complete non-factor in the rushing game. Plus, Buddy gets a rushing touchdown. We know that's not going to happen every single week. So I know that he'll regress based on that. The other part of it is that, good Lord, Middle Tennessee State's passing defense, according to our numbers at C2C Winning Edge here, is the worst in the FBS. They are dead last. and their rating is worse than what I consider to be an average FCS defensive passing performance. Just to give you an idea of just how absolutely piss poor Middle Tennessee State's passing defense has been this year. And Louisiana Tech was able to take advantage of it, and they weren't able to really take advantage of it against anybody else this year. So Evan Bullock, I'm not buying it. I think that he'll run into some trouble here in the next couple of weeks. My first running back that I have as a waiver wire trap this week is Mr. Jordan Simmons, running back out of Akron, went against Western Michigan this past week. And there's a couple of things here, right? We want to believe, based on Joe Moorhead's past, that we're going to get one of those workhorse backs that he is known for at Akron, which could be absolutely incredible for CFF purposes going up against the MAC here, right? But we just haven't seen it so far with Joe Moorhead there at Akron. And I can see some people getting fooled into thinking we finally got it here with Jordan Simmons. Because Jordan Simmons, again, a guy transferring in from Michigan State, right? Like big fish, small pond kind of deal. Power 4 backs have done extremely well in the MAC here in recent years. But up until this point in the season, Simmons had not gotten more than 10 attempts. Granted, he's had some really good, efficient games. Again, 109 yards versus Rutgers. That was obviously a pretty good sign, maybe. But he's got games of 49 yards, 19 yards, 3 yards, 73 yards, and then 63 yards this past weekend on the ground on 13 attempts and a touchdown. He also got 97 yards on 6 catches, so averaging 16.2 yards per catch. That's not something I'm expecting out of a running back moving forward. Heck, his last 2 games where he even had receiving work, Simmons was averaging 4 yards and 6.4 yards per catch on that. So that's going to regress quite a bit there. I don't expect to see Simmons getting that kind of workload moving forward, given what we've seen in the recent past here, given what we've seen what Joe Moorhead's done. It feels like every time we think we have one at Akron, they regress the next week. So I'm telling you, don't go after Jordan Simmons. Another running back here to not go after, is Kylan James, running back out of UNLV. Had himself a really solid game this past week against Utah State. 13 carries, 105 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Congratulations to you, Mr. James. I'm very, very happy for you. Problem is, you've not had more than 8 touches in a game up until this point of the season. And even this past weekend, you only got 13 touches. You just happen to be very, very efficient on them, which, congratulations, that's great. You can maybe earn more touches with that. But given what we know about Brennan Marion, he does not want a feature back. He loves rotating backs in his system. So I'm telling you to avoid it there. It also doesn't help that Utah State is another one of these teams that's just absolutely atrocious on defense. They're starting to figure out the offensive side of the ball here a little bit, which is obviously very nice. But when we look at their performance to this point in the season so far, if I can look it up here real quick. Good Lord, I can't find it. There it is. Yeah, they are currently bottom 5 in the country in defensive team performance against the rush. So again, good job, James. You did what you're supposed to in taking advantage of a bad matchup here. But at the end of the day, that's all it was. And I'm not planning on picking you up and moving you forward here. Let's look at some wide receivers. Got a couple of wide receivers that are quintessential waiver wire traps. That wide receiver had themselves some really big games this past weekend. The first one here is Reginald Virgil, the wide receiver out of Miami of Ohio. I have given up this season on trying to figure out who the, your prototypical wide receiver 1 from Miami of Ohio would be this year. I whiffed on McDonald. I whiffed on Javon Tracy again. And now this week, people are going to be probably chasing after Virgil a little bit this week. And I'm telling you guys, I wouldn't go that direction. Yes, he had 13 targets the week before against Toledo. Caught 4 of those balls for 76 yards. That seems like some good bones right there, maybe for the future. But this next week, where he actually had a really big game, 3 targets though. 3 catches, 113 yards, and 2 touchdowns. If you think that is sustainable week to week, I've got a oceanfront property to sell you in Nebraska. Like I said, I'm tired of trying to guess. Miami of Ohio is going to have a different favorite every single week, at least for right now. Even when a guy is going to even if a guy does emerge week to week, maybe Virgil goes back and has 10 targets next week, another 100 yards, I still don't think I'm going to fully trust it, just be given the fact that that offense has just had different favorites all year long. I ain't touching it. The other one here, the other waiver wire trap at wide receiver I wish to discuss is Mr. Michael Matheson. A great performance this past weekend against UTEP. 3 touchdowns on the day. I wasn't watching this game. I had my eyes on a different game at the time, and I believe I was watching the James Madison game. And I was just kind of getting the score alerts for Western Kentucky, and I saw Matheson just touchdown after touchdown after touchdown. And I was like, oh man, that's so great. He is back. He's healthy. He's been a guy that a couple of us been looking at in this Western Kentucky offense as a potential, big play threat, big, like a guy to play on the outside there. Seems like he fit in this offense really, really well. And I was like, oh, that's great. Maybe we can finally see him as a potential opposite outside wide receiver of Keyshawn Johnson. That'd be so great to see. Then I looked at his box score here. And yes, he did score 3 touchdowns indeed, but he also had only 2 catches for 17 yards and 2 rushing attempts for 16 yards, and he got 3 touchdowns on that. He had 4 attempts. He had 4 touches in this entire game, and he scored touchdowns on 3 of them. And on one hand, you'd be like, oh, well, he's a touchdown scorer. Like, he's a guy that, can break a long one. Well, he didn't break any long ones here. He just got incredibly lucky down in the red zone. I think this might be one of the most insane stat lines I've ever seen. I don't think I've ever seen a wide receiver finish a game with 4 catches, or basically 4 touches for 33 yards and 3 touchdowns. That is, if you're not catching my drift here at this point, completely unsustainable. And it's not like Matheson's had big weeks before this point. He's not had more than 3 targets in a single game up until this point. Don't go chasing touchdowns here. It's going to completely disappoint you next week. Completely avoid Mr. Matheson here. Moving on, let's get over to some of these actual waiver wire pickups for this week. I will say before we get into it a little bit, with the quarterbacks, I got a couple of MAC quarterbacks here that I like for this week, but I'm only going to really cover 2 of them because, and I'll pull up the waiver wire honorable mentions slide here. Just like last week, y'all, there are a ton of fantastic quarterbacks on the waiver wire still that have not been picked up. And many of which this past week were helping people win their matchups this past week. Caden Veldkamp, quarterback out of West Kentucky, still available or still only rostered on 28%. He had himself a 30-point plus game this past week. Tyler Huff, this past week for Jacksonville State, another great game from him, 27.64 fantasy points. Haj Malik Williams, rostered on 28% of rosters. He himself had himself a 28 or 27-point game this past week. Kevin Jennings, the starting quarterback out of SMU, starting Rhett Lashley quarterback, still available in 90% of leagues. He had himself a great game the last time he went out there. Dual threat quarterback in Rhett Lashley's system does not belong on the waiver wire. And then I'll add in a quarterback from this past week that I mentioned, Spencer Petras, quarterback out of Utah State. Roster still on only 6% of rosters. I get it. He's a pocket passer. You're not really loving that. But man, he's been on fire the last couple of weeks, and Utah State's Utah State's defense in general is just so atrocious that Utah State has to pass the ball in order to keep up. He has passing attempt numbers of 41 and 59 the last 2 weeks. They are not afraid to air out the ball. He's had 372 passing yards against Boise State, 461 passing yards versus UNLV, 3 touchdowns in each of those games, finishing with 27 plus fantasy points in both those games. Again, I get it. Some people don't love a pocket passer, but 1, if you're in 6-point passing touchdown league, this is a no-brainer. But 2, even if you don't love pocket passers, right, this is the kind of pocket passer that you're willing to invest in. A guy that is on a team with an atrocious defense is going to have to throw the ball a crap ton in order to keep up and, quite frankly, be locked in for 350 plus every single week. I think he's a no-brainer. But again, there's even more guys than what I have here on the slide, right? I didn't even mention Sawyer Robertson, who's been doing well for Baylor. Brendan Lewis, who had himself a really nice game this past week, 25 points against Oregon State, which shout out Wolfpack for beating Oregon State. I never would have guessed that one in a million years. And then also Ben Wooldridge, the quarterback of Louisiana, had himself a nice game recently as well. So, like, if you're looking for quarterbacks, so many great options that are out there on the waiver wire we've discussed before. But even if you don't like those guys, I've got a couple of quarterbacks here that we can discuss from the MAC that'll be pretty interesting down the line if you so choose to subscribe to the cult of Maction and hope that this year is much better than what we got last year, which, to be fair, so far, doing great. The offenses look a lot better in the MAC this year. Let's start with our first quarterback here, and that is Parker Navarro, the quarterback out of Ohio. The Ohio Bobcats here rostered on 6% of leagues this past week, 22 passing attempts, completing 13 of them for 147 yards and a touchdown, while also rushing 14 times for 176 yards and a touchdown on the ground here. First of all, shout out to Tim Albin. Man, what a hell of a job he's done with Ohio this year. This roster got absolutely gutted and raided this offseason. Its best pieces on both sides of the ball being taken by pretty much everybody, including their starting quarterback, Curtis Rourke, Sia Bangura leaving. Miles Cross, their wide receiver 2, is gone. They obviously lost Sam Wiglis, but that was more to graduation. That was happening regardless. But despite all of that, like, Ohio's currently first in the MAC, and its only losses this year have come against Syracuse, who they gave quite a scare to, and then Kentucky, and that was without Parker Navarro even starting in that game, so I don't think Ohio even really had a chance without Navarro. At the center of this has been Parker Navarro at quarterback, right? I just mentioned, like, in the one game that they didn't have him, Kentucky absolutely destroyed Ohio, right? This past offseason, Navarro was in competition for most of the offseason with C.J. Harris before Harris just kind of transferred after the spring and, went to be the third-string quarterback at Cal. Navarro kind of took it and literally ran with it. He has been super incredible for rushing purposes in CFF. He hasn't had a game with over 200 yards passing this year, but man, he's been so good on the ground for the most part. Especially now that we're getting into MAC play. These past 2 weeks, he has done incredibly well against Central Michigan and Akron. He's rushed for 13 plus times in each of those games, 110 plus yards and a touchdown in each of those games. Now, so far, this offense hasn't really shown that it can hit, 40 points in a game, but if it ever does, Navarro's ceiling could be absolutely limitless, very much in the same realm as like what Tyler Huff's been able to do with Jacksonville State here. And the good news is that Navarro's upcoming schedule includes a trio of teams who have struggled greatly against the run. This includes Miami of Ohio, who's 103rd in defensive rush team performance, Buffalo, who's 84th, and then Kent State, who's bottom 3 in the country against the run. There's a ton of opportunity to Navarro to absolutely feast over these next coming weeks. So if you're a team that's struggling at quarterback and you need to find a guy at least for the next couple of weeks to get you through, Navarro is a no-brainer, in my opinion. The other MAC quarterback that I want to take a look at here is Tommy Ulatowski, quarterback out of Kent State, rostered on 2% of leagues right now. This past week, passing 36 times, completing 17 of them for 394 yards and 4 touchdowns. He also had -10 rushing yards. He's very much a pocket passer. This is so funny to me because one of my favorite memories from this offseason has to be when I got lunch with Chris K, Heath Boyd, Andrew Katz, and Kyle Franchise. Very, very fun lunch. But one of the things that we ended up doing was kind of having this kind of joke debate where we were trying to decide who should be the 114th quarterback, or the QB 114th in our rankings. And our two options were Cade McConnell, who I'm pretty sure doesn't even really exist anymore at UTEP, and then Tommy Ulatowski, which, for those of us in that joke argument fighting for Ulatowski, we're kind of being vindicated a little bit, as much as that matters for anything. But Ulatowski's done pretty well for Kent State, right? As we understand every offseason, right, like Kent State players will gain a lot more value as they exit the physical abuse known as their offense out of conference schedule. That was once again true this year. Although this offense seems to have more value than we initially expecting coming into this year, Ulatowski has come in the wake of Devin Cargman's injury, and quite frankly, he has looked better in my opinion, and he's been great for CFF. He scored 30 plus points in 4-point passing touchdown league formats each of the last 2 weeks. The Golden Flashes seem to feel a lot more comfortable airing the ball out, especially now against Maction competition, right? Over the last 2 weeks, he's seen 10 plus yards per attempt, 340 plus yards, and 3 touchdowns in each of his starts. They are just chucking the ball deep with Ulatowski. They are absolutely atrocious on defense, and it's very similar to Spencer Petras, right, where they gotta constantly be chucking it deep to keep up with their offense, especially in the second half of games. They're constantly having to throw the ball around, and Ulatowski has been phenomenal on that front. Again, I don't love the fact his completion percentages like hovers between 45 and 55%, right? But when you have a ADOT of around 20 into your targets, like, good freaking Lord, I love it all the same. Like, this is absolutely incredible effort play by Kent State. Just seeing what they can get downfield. They got the wide receivers to do it, and more on that here in a second. But even with all of that to be excited about, there's a couple caveats to note here with Ulatowski, right? In both of these previous contests, Kent State was playing from behind, leading to some, like I said, some more aggressive downfield shots from Ulatowski. But I don't really expect that to change given their defensive performance so far this season. I do have to note that while Ulatowski's numbers are impressive so far, these performances have come against Eastern Michigan and Ball State, who are ranked 102nd and 133rd in defensive passing team performance. So that is some atrocious defenses that Ulatowski's been able to take advantage of. But, it's better than him not being able to do that at all. Their upcoming schedule includes Bowling Green, who's 55th in that same category, Western Michigan, who's 128th. That's a really nice matchup you can probably play Ulatowski in. And then Ohio, who's 60th. So I think that Ulatowski, given this style of offense that Kent State's going with, you can probably still comfortably start him especially in a 6-point passing touchdown league. I think you can comfortably start him against Bowling Green, Ohio, but I wouldn't fully recommend it. I love that matchup against Western Michigan coming up. Regardless of anything, Ulatowski's been a very pleasant surprise for us, and I do think him being the quarterback helps this entire offense get elevated for CFF purposes, so I'm excited to see what we get out of him moving forward. So, with all that being said, let's move on to some running backs that you guys can take a look at for this week after I take a quick sip of water here. All right, we are back and we are ready to go. Let's take a look at some of these running backs this week. Nobody this week is quite the same level as, the Trey Stewarts, the Tawee Walkers from last week. Those are two very pleasant surprises after weeks of terrible running back options off the waiver wire. Those guys were an absolute blessing. We're back kind of towards the middle here. We got some good options here that I like, but are definitely going to require some monitoring. But the first two here, I'm feeling pretty confident as guys to be confident in moving forward, right? I had a different word in my mouth, and for some reason, my brain just couldn't fully put it together. Anyway, let's talk about Savion Red, running back out of Nevada. Rostered on 16% of rosters this past week, 23 attempts, 137 yards, and 4 touchdowns. Also caught a ball for 12 yards there. I have been keeping a close eye on Nevada this year, mostly because, again, I mentioned it last week when I talked about Brendan Lewis. I was not prepared for this offense from Nevada to actually be good. I was fully buying against Nevada. I completely dismissed them, and they have put me in shame because of that. This is a team that has surpassed much of my expectations and, quite frankly, has become a very CFF relevant option. And the latest piece to really get solved there, it seems, is their running back position, with Savion Red. Savion Red, it feels like it was only a matter of time, given what I've seen over the last couple of weeks, that he would fully take over this Wolf Pack backfield, right? Coming into the season, he kind of entered this backfield that included some intriguing options like, young Ashton Hayes there. Sean Dollars was still sticking around from Oregon, the Oregon transfer there. And then Boston College transfer Pat Garwo was coming in. But here we are halfway through the season, and one injured Dollars, one transfer of Hayes to wide receiver, and many booty performances from Garwo later. Suddenly this backfield is kind of cleared out for Red here. And it also helps that Red's been performing well on a down-to-down basement, pretty far ahead of pretty much every running back onto this team against opponents not named Minnesota. Red has averaged 6.9 plus yards per carry in every game for Nevada this season. This is a very much for what it seems like, a big fish, small pond scenario where, again, we got a former 4-star player transferring 1 year after being at Texas, coming down to the G5 and just absolutely wrecking crap. But despite all of that, the staff just hadn't given him the full commitment, right, as their go-to guy, right? In the first 5 games of the season, the most touches he got was 13 in a single game, which, isn't the worst thing in the world, especially for a high-efficiency guy like Savion Red. It's not like he's had bad performances to this point in the season, 24 points against Eastern Washington, 13.5 versus Troy, but that's all changed this past weekend against Oregon State, arguably one of the hardest opponents that Nevada's had to face up until this point in the season. The staff has now fully committed to Red, and they reaped the rewards greatly, right? Not only did the Wolfpack upset the Beavers in general, but Red had himself a monster day. I mentioned already, 137 yards, 4 touchdowns, finishing as the RB1 for this past weekend. To me, going forward, it would be absolute coaching malpractice to not continue to feature Red. I'm not just partially saying that as a CFF analyst and guy just wanting great options in CFF, right? But also just in general, right? We've seen Red do so well to this point in the season. Like, he is clearly their best back. Why not just hand it off to him as many times as you can in a single game, right? It would also break tendency for Matt Lubbock, who the offensive coordinator there, who saw the success that having a feature back can do during his time at Kansas the last 2 years. I will say, though, compared to, a guy like Parker Navarro, the schedule going forward doesn't scream opportunities for Red to feast, considering his next 3 games are against Fresno State, Fresno State, Hawaii, and Colorado State, who all 3 are right around the middle of the country when it comes to CDC Winning Edge's defensive rushing team performance metric. But shoot, given what we've seen Red do over the last couple of weeks, right? Like, if he just keeps doing what he's doing, if he can keep that efficiency up, as long as these teams as long as Nevada's not getting blown out and they're having to play from behind, and that kills Red's value there, I think Red's still going to be a major feature of this offense, and they're going to use him to keep in games. So I love Red moving forward. Again, is there a chance that he goes back to only 13 carries a game? Possibly, but I think given what we saw this past week and him basically single-handedly carrying the Wolfpack to a win against a former Power 4 team there in Oregon State, I think they got to keep riding with him. Let's move on to another running back here, Mr. Ahmad Hardy, running back out of UM Monroe, rostered on 11% of rosters. This past week, he had himself 15 attempts for 121 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground. Going back to week 1, I had listed Ahmad Hardy as a player to avoid on the waiver wire. I mean, back then, not only did I just not trust a true freshman breaking out that early, but Hardy also was even listed on the 2 deep going into that game. So I was very concerned that, he was going to quickly be buried again. The staff would go back to the 2 guys that they had atop that list. And since then, Hardy isn't going away. He's shown himself to be too good to keep off the field for his staff. And throughout the season, he has seen 14 plus carries in every game against G5 opponents. In those games, he's finished with less than 5 yards per carry only once. And his rushing production profile is stellar for a true freshman, finishing with 80 plus yards in 4 of his last 6 games, despite him having limited opportunities in most of these games. So you might be sitting there thinking, like, Jared, you were just telling us about some of these running backs earlier that had only like 15 carries. Why is Hardy so different here? And that is because, again, we look at Bryant Vincent, the head coach there at UL Monroe, who, by the way, is doing a fantastic job with UL Monroe. I don't think anybody expected UL Monroe to win 5 of their first 6 games. So shout out Bryant Vincent for getting this team to follow him there. But Bryant Vincent's RB1 is a coveted position in the CFF world, right? Recall names like Ja'Cory Crosky-Merritt last year, Dwayne McBride, Spencer Brown. Like, as long as Vincent has his number 1 guy, he will feed him. And so far at UL Monroe, we haven't really had that fully, but Hardy by far seems like the best example or the top candidate to become that down the stretch, right? We've seen him already get that treatment once in the game against Troy, where Hardy had 28 carries for 107 yards. So we know they're not quite afraid to feed him in this context. So I think if they ever decide to just ground and pound it, Hardy will get quickly back to that 20 plus, maybe even 25 plus carries a game there. He's got some really good opportunities coming up. You got South Alabama and Marshall. They've got some big weeks, but before he gets to some tougher matchups against Texas State and Auburn. Regardless, I like Hardy's performance so far. He has potential to slide into a CFF monster role, given what we've seen with Bryant Vincent before. So I think he's absolutely worth grabbing and storing off of the waiver wire, and especially seeing what he can do in the matchups against South Alabama and Marshall. Marshall especially seems like a place where Hardy could go absolutely wild, given how poor their rushing defense has been so far this year. Moving on to our next running back here, Mr. Trey Wisner out of Texas, rostered on 19% of rosters. This past week, 13 attempts, 118 yards, and a touchdown. He also had 4 catches for 12 yards here. Is this the first year that we're going to see that a Steve Sarkisian running back not reach 1,000 yards on the season? Currently, it's heading that way, considering that nobody in this backfield has reached even 300 yards on the season, and we're halfway through the season, so we're looking at 600 yards max. But granted, this backfield's been littered with injuries, inconsistent play, and even more than that to contribute to all of the lack of production in the Texas running back room. Is it going to stop me from jumping on a potential emerging RB1 here in Wisner for the rest of the season for Texas? No, sir, it will not. The elephant in the room here is Jadon Blue. And Jadon Blue has been so dang hard to figure out, man, right? Like, he gets 25 carries versus UL Monroe, and it seems like Texas is fully going to commit to him after, not really giving him the opportunity in the weeks before, right? Like, they were still kind of like figuring out. Blue gets banged up, so they're kind of holding him back then he misses a game. He comes back versus UL Monroe, and then he looks like the Texas RB1. You're like, all right, let's go, here we go. And then he gets 6 carries versus Mississippi State, fumbles twice, I might add, and this staff is completely really just kicked him to the curb, honestly. Again, we didn't see him again in that game against Mississippi State. And then this past week against Oklahoma, we only saw him get 10 carries and 3 receptions in that game. So very much the staff's back to giving Blue limited carries. Meanwhile, Wisner's right there with him, and Wisner's just straight up outproduced Blue at every opportunity the past couple of weeks. Again, as I mentioned before, 13 carries, 118 yards in this game against Oklahoma. And the week before against Mississippi State, 13 carries, 88 yards, and a catch for 12 yards. In that game, didn't score a touchdown. But regardless, like, the efficiency is absolutely massive here for Wisner. By the way, I didn't even mention the fact that Wisner should have gotten 2 touchdowns this past week against Oklahoma. He just happened to fumble in the end zone. So I still need to see Wisner get that quintessential Sarkisian RB1 workload before I fully buy in here. But given Blue's troubles and Wisner's recent performance, 1, I expect it to be sooner rather than later, but also 2, I think it's a good bet to go on, right? I don't expect, or how do I phrase this? the upside of having the Texas RB1, even if it's only for 6 games here, having the true quintessential Steve Sarkisian RB1 is worth taking the risk on grabbing Wisner off the waiver wire for this week. So that being said, I'll move on from Wisner. I think he is a better bet right now to be the Steve Sarkisian RB1 than Jadon Blue is. So moving on to our 4th running back of the day here is Elijah Gillum of Fresno State. I've seen this movie before. Malik Sherrod comes in. He is a clear RB1 for Fresno State going into the year, and then he gets banged up. And that means that Elijah Gillum comes in and he basically takes over that exact workload. And that is a shame on me this offseason. People kept asking me about, all right, who's good handcuffs, who's good handcuffs, who's good handcuffs. And I never mentioned Elijah Gillum. And that is, quite frankly, on me, because it was clear as day that if Sherrod ever went down for an extended period of time, that Gillum would instantly go into that role. And we've seen that in 2 of the last 3 weeks, right? Gillum against New Mexico, where Sherrod missed time, 18 carries, 54 yards, and a touchdown. And then this past week against Washington State, 20 carries, 120 yards, and a touchdown with 4 catches for 8 yards. You're talking about opportunity on top of opportunity here. And as long as Sherrod is still out, Gillum shouldn't be hanging out on the waiver wire, quite frankly. Now, this is a risk that you're going to take, but that's what you have to do at this point in the season. We're not going to always get Toby Walkers and Trey Stewarts and Savion Reds kind of blowing up. Sometimes you got to take advantage of injury situations, and Gillum's absolutely one of those guys to take a look at here. Now, over the next couple of weeks, definitely if Gillum is still the main guy, some really nice opportunities here. They got Nevada this upcoming week, who's 98th against the run, according to C2C winning edge. You follow that with San Jose State, who's 91st versus the run. Then you get Hawaii. That's a little bit tougher, but at that point, you're kind of playing with Sherrod coming back at that point, if he isn't back even earlier than that. So I wouldn't even project out that far. If you need running backs, especially with bye weeks over the next couple of weeks, right? I mean, Ashton Jeanty is off this week, right? I think Gillum is a must-add off waiver wires, and you just pay very close attention to Fresno State reports as the week goes along. So I like Gillum. I think, again, he's going to pick up right where he was last year whenever he was the main back. That was great for several games before Sherrod came back, so I'm riding with him again this year. He should be great. Last running back I'm going to throw out here is a guy that I the system's not here. And we are very much relying on efficiency with him sometimes, but also we're starting to get to the point where the staff's realizing that they have a very, very good running back here in Mr. CJ Campbell, running back out of Florida Atlantic, rostered on 18% of rosters here. This past week against North Texas, 18 carries, 89 yards, and a touchdown. Also had 6 catches for 74 yards here as well. You look at Tom Herman's offensive history, and RB1s have just not really been a thing. He's almost always gone committee with his approaches. And while we're certainly looking at somewhat of a committee approach between Campbell and Zubli, this is very similar to the Savion Red situation, where CJ Campbell was a blue chip option going to Florida State last year, and he's transferred to after 1 year, going down to the G5. And quite frankly, he's dominating over the last couple of games. 8.8 yards versus UConn, 9.2 yards versus Wagner, and then this past week, 4.9 yards versus North Texas, which, doesn't sound great at first, but surprisingly, North Texas is actually pretty solid against the run. So I'm not super surprised about that. I'm also stoked to see him get 6 catches for 74 yards. It's nice to see him get some receiving work as well, so that he's not game scripted out of a lot of games. But even still, I can't ignore that CJ Campbell is clearly the best back on this team right now, and I think he's getting more and more workload as the season goes along here. He scored a touchdown in each of his last 4 games. He's had multiple touchdowns in 2 of the last 4 games. Again, having that reception work is really, really nice as well. I think this is just one of those scenarios where you got to bet on talent against his level of competition, and I'm willing to take a look at it. His upcoming performances are a little queasy. Again, I don't trust UTSA's defense a ton. Their passing attack is absolutely atrocious. But apparently, according to our numbers at C2C Winning Edge, their rushing defense is pretty solid. They're 22nd in the country. So I'm a little worried there that Campbell could be stuffed up a little bit, even though it looks like a nice matchup. And then 2 weeks after that, they get South Florida, who's 72nd versus the run. I think Campbell should be more than good enough to perform well in that game as well. So I like what Campbell can do moving forward. Let's take a look at our honorable mentions. The only new name among the honorable mentions is Josh McCray, very similar to Elijah Gillum, right, where I have no clue how long Caden Fagan's out, but it's pretty clear based on this past week's performance. 16 carries, 78 yards, and 2 touchdowns with another 3 catches for 46 yards and a touchdown there. That McCray is the main guy for Illinois as long as Fagan's out. I think it's worth grabbing him off the waiver wire just to see what happens with Fagan this week, because McCray being the main guy sounds like a pretty awesome time. And then pretty much the rest of the honorable mentions, very similar to quarterbacks, are guys, there's a ton of great running backs from previous weeks that are still on the waiver wire. Looking at you, Trey Stewart, who's still available in 62% of leagues. Tommy Walker, who's still available in 69% of leagues. Nice. Isaac Brown, the true freshman running back out of Louisville, who got himself a really, really nice workload this past week with 20 carries for 146 yards and 2 touchdowns. He's still available in 81% of leagues. And then Avery Morrow, the running back out of Colorado State, who's had 20 plus carries and a touchdown plus in each of his last 3 games. He's still available in 70% of leagues. So even if you don't like the guys that I talked about above, guys like CJ Campbell, guys like Elijah Gillum, right? You're like, I don't really want to deal with, those guys. You're having to keep track of, injury reports throughout the week. Fine. Go grab Stewart, go grab Walker, go grab Brown, go grab Morrow. Like, these guys are available in a ton of leagues. So that being said, let's move on to our wide receivers for this week. Looking over the wide receivers, again, it's not quite as bleak as it was last week. Last week, I whiffed so hard outside of Jackson Meeks with my wide receiver options this last week, but I am going to go ahead and say that I feel better about this week's options. Again, there's some caveats with pretty much all 4 of them, 5 of them, 5.5, because one of them I kind of smushed 2 guys in to talk about at the same time. But you know what? I'm rambling. Let's get into it. Let's talk about Luke Flory here. If you're watching this on YouTube, you see his pretty little face up on the screen here. This past week, 11 targets, 6 catches, 130 yards, and a touchdown, rostered on 15% of leagues. I try not to repeat players on this show, and I think I have talked Floria before, but I do think it's been long enough that I think it's worth recognizing him again, especially with him only being rostered on 15% of leagues. Again, I get why people didn't want to add him back then, considering he still had the likes of, Penn State still on the schedule. I forget who else they faced. That was Tennessee still on the schedule, and then they had Pitt. I mean, they had Pitt to start the season. He scored a touchdown in that game, but Tennessee, Penn State still on the schedule. I get why people didn't really want to do it, and he didn't look great in those games. But with all that being said, right, while Floria's partner in crime, Christian McCray, is clearly still the prize pig of this offense, Flory has been productive in his own right. Like, I discussed Tommy Ulatowski earlier in the column, and he, in addition to this Kent State offense finally reaching MAC play, has been a revelation for both Floria and McCray. Like, the defense is easier, and Ulatowski really only has eyes for Floria and McCray, right? Like, if you look at the last 2 games that Ulatowski has started, he has thrown the ball 56 times, and of those 56 pass attempts, 40, and I repeat, 40 of them have gone to either McCray or to Floria. So, yeah, McCray is still the main guy here, but Floria is clearly the number 2 option for this route. And in terms of the way he's used, he doesn't even need as many targets as Christian McCray to have himself some nice weeks, just like he did this past week, right? Floria plays in the slot, but he isn't really treated like you would normally expect a slot to be treated, right? Normally a slot means, higher target numbers, shorter ADOT. Floria is like shorter ADOT and relying on, yards after catch. Floria is like the complete opposite, right? He's getting less targets than McCray consistently. He's posting a higher ADOT. Over the last 2 games, he's got 4 ADOTs, average depth of target, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, of 19 yards and 24.3 yards in the game before. Compare that to McCray, who had 16.3 average depth of target in both of those games. So, like I said, Floria, he's playing in the slot, but you're almost treating him like you would expect an outside wide receiver to play, right? This is fantastic news considering that even though he's getting less targets, it means he doesn't have to have a ton of targets to have big games. With Kent State playing consistently from behind, Floria is going to get involved every single game. I love the fact that, like I said earlier with Ulotowski, like they're chucking it deep. They are giving these guys deep, high value targets every single time that they're throwing them the ball. And so considering that, again, I fully expect Floria to be involved in every single game, I like where this is heading, and especially that matchup against Western Michigan in a couple of weeks seems like incredibly juicy. But regardless, I think Floria is going to be absolutely incredible for CFF. He's also a good bet to find the end zone. He's done so in every game against a G5 opponent to this point in the season. So I'm feeling pretty good about Floria. Next up, we have Aaron Anderson, wide receiver out of LSU, rostered on 27% of leagues. This past week, 7 targets, 3 catches, 81 yards, and a touchdown versus the likes of Ole Miss. During the offseason, Kyron Lacy was who everyone rightfully aimed for during the offseason. It's kind of that top target for LSU's passing attack this season. But there was also plenty of discussion to be had about who that secondary option was going to be, right? While most aimed for the likes of, CJ Daniels or Xavion Thomas, guilty on the Xavion Thomas train, 2 guys that seemed like they would replace Brian Thomas on the boundary. Many of us kind of forgot about the former 5-star kind of living in the slot for the Tigers, right? Kyron Lacy moving mostly to the outside this season, a change from last year, by the way. It's provided Aaron Anderson a ton of opportunity to get there out on the field. Very much a move made by the coaching staff to get their best players on the field at the same time. And he's become a pretty clear number 2 option for Nussmeier, at least among his wide receivers, right? Anderson's currently 3rd on the team in targets behind Lacy, who has 56. Mason Taylor's got 43, but Aaron Anderson's not far behind with 41, right? In no game so far has he had less than 6 targets, and until this past week against Ole Miss, Anderson actually hadn't had a game where he had less than 5 catches, so in a PPR sense, he was absolute gold for a floor play every single week, right? His lack of touchdowns was a bit of a concern to start the season, but over the last 2 weeks, that's kind of been remedied a little bit. He's got a touchdown in each of those last 2 games. Like I said, PPR formats, this is a no-brainer. He's got a really nice floor, and in his last 4 games, he's been pretty consistent in his production. He's got 73-plus yards one way or another in each of his last 4 games. So with SEC defenses continuing to kind of send their best against Kyron Lacy, I do think opportunities are going to continue to abound for Anderson, and he does have the talent to grow beyond even the way he's being used here. I expect some pretty big games for Aaron Anderson down the line. Again, they got Arkansas, Texas A&M coming up. A&M's pretty solid against the pass, but LSU is going to be going up against Bama here in about 4 weeks. I think Anderson could absolutely eat in a game like that, especially if Alabama does not get their defensive struggles in the secondary figured out. Moving on, let's talk about another wide receiver here in Matt Sykes, the wide receiver out of Rice, rostered on 3% of leagues. This past week, 11 targets, 7 catches, 85 yards, and a touchdown. You want to talk about consistent? This is your guy over the last 3 weeks. He's been absolutely great. But going back to the beginning of the season, right, one of the first few surprises of the CFF season was that Landon Ramsey-Goles was injured, and since the start of the season, we haven't heard a peep out of him. And then to confound us even further, right, like Rawson McNeil was the other wide receiver we're kind of targeting for the Owls here, and he's been buried down the depth chart. So we had a complete blank slate at the wide receiver position to see kind of who would emerge for Rice, and it seems like we have our guy. Matt Sykes has been great for Rice over the last couple of weeks. While he's definitely not, on the level of like a Luke McCaffrey, right? If you're chasing volume like I do, Sykes is a guy you got to be looking at here, right? Over the last 3 weeks, Sykes has had 11 plus targets in each of his last 3 games, 80 plus yards in each of his games. Actually kind of scary how consistent he's been. Again, you're looking at games of 82, 84, and 85 yards over the last 3 weeks, right? Sykes is separating himself very much as a game changer in this offense, right? Which is why his targets have increased over the last few weeks. Among the starting options at wide receiver, Sykes is pretty clearly the most efficient with 12.2 yards per catch. Compare that to everybody else in the room who all have less than 10 yards a catch. I will say, though, one thing that kind of caps his ceiling a bit is that he doesn't have much run after the catch ability. So you're kind of getting what you get when it comes to where they choose to target him, which, is pretty solid, right? They're averaging about 10 yards down the field with him. But I wouldn't expect too much of a higher ceiling in terms of his production moving forward, right? But what he does now is more than good enough, especially in a PPR setting. So, taking a look at his upcoming schedule, he's got Tulane, UConn, and Navy. I'll admit, that's not the most ideal schedule for a G5 wide receiver. All 3 of these teams are average to above average in defensive passing team performance, according to C2C Winning Edge. It's even more concerning when you see that 2 of Sykes' good performances over the last couple of weeks against UTSA and Charlotte are 2 teams that are well below average in that exact same metric. So maybe we're looking at a bit of a mirage here for Sykes, but the saving grace is that Sykes performed just as well against Army, who's in the same range as kind of Rice's upcoming schedule in that defensive team passing performance. Defensive passing team performance. And so that kind of provides me some hope that he's going to continue this very consistent stretch. And again, once again, no brainer in a PPR setting. So I like Sykes moving forward. Let's move on to our next wide receiver here. And that is Mr. Jordan Tyson, the wide receiver out of Arizona State, rostered on 14% of leagues. I love Kenny Dillingham's offense, and I've been really, really waiting for there to become a consistent, true number 1 guy for Arizona State, and it looks like that's kind of what we're getting with Tyson here. This past week, 7 targets, 5 catches, 84 yards, and a touchdown. The week before, 9 targets, 6 catches, 76 yards, and 2 touchdowns there. Very much looking at a guy that is, and 2 weeks before that against Texas State, 8 targets, 6 catches, 120 yards, and a touchdown. He's had 16 plus fantasy points in 3 out of his last 4 games, 20 plus in 2 out of his last 4 games. I think that Levis quickly finding his safety blanket, and that bears out in the target numbers, right? Tyson is clearly the number 1 target in the passing game with 43 targets to this point in the season. The next closest is Cameron Scatabo with 24, and then Xavier Guillory, who has 21 targets to this point in the season. So clear number 1 guy. His role, I think, is going to grow even more as, again, he's coming back from injury. It's nice to see him playing healthy here. And Arizona State's, again, done pretty solid over the last couple of weeks, right? They are somebody that they're not out of it in terms of Big 12 contention just yet. And so they're going to rely more and more on their guys that are kind of their main guys to go to. I think Tyson's going to be getting even more targets moving forward. And it helps that their upcoming schedule is absolutely fantastic, right? Don't love the bye, but Cincinnati they're going up against, and they are 89th versus the pass. And then they follow that up after the bye week against Oklahoma State, who's 101st against the pass, according to C2C Winning Edge. So some great matchups coming up for Jordan Tyson. His efficiencies should kick up, right? This is a dude that's been averaging 12 plus yards per game, or 12 plus yards per catch per game in each of his last 4 games. And he's had 16 plus in 3 out of those 4 games. So I think that he's going to continue to eat as the schedule moves along here. I think that his role is going to grow even more as Levitt gets more and more comfortable. So I really like Jordan Tyson moving forward. My last wide receiver that I'm going to throw out here is very similar to the likes of Elijah Gillum and Josh McCray, where there's some injury caveat here, right? But I also think there's a bit of hinting that there's a potential that, even if the other option comes back, that this guy's not going to give up this job. And that is Jack Hestera, wide receiver out of Utah State, rostered on 1% of leagues this past week. 12 targets, 10 catches, 152 yards, and a touchdown. Whether or not we are looking at Hestera, who is kind of the backup slot option, or Kyrie's White, who is the typical starting slot option. To me, it's pretty clear that the slot option in this offense is back to being relevant after, a very slow start to the season here, right? Spencer Petras is throwing the ball, 40, 50 times a game here, right? There's plenty of opportunities, and it looks like, you're looking at an outside guy and a slot guy really stepping up here. Obviously, Jalen Royals has been fantastic over the last couple of weeks, but if you look at, Hestera and Kyrie's White combined, right? 13 targets against Temple, 9 targets versus Boise State, and then 12 targets versus UNLV this past week. This slot position is an incredible opportunity for volume plays, but naturally, it can't be simple, right? It can't just be one of these guys or the other. Kyrie's White started the game against UNLV, but went down after 4 snaps, did not return to the game. We have not gotten any kind of official word on White moving forward, although some of the beat writers do seem to kind of hint that it wasn't super serious, so maybe we see him back next week. But regardless, very much like Elijah Gillum, right, I think this is too important of a CFF spot for you to not take advantage of the fact that both Hestera and White are pretty widely available, right? Again, Hestera is only 1% rostered, White's 10% rostered. If you're struggling at wide receiver and you just got to take shots on some guys, right, this is the opportunity to do so and try to grab one of Hestera, probably both Hestera and White, and just kind of see how it plays out during the week. They got some really nice games coming up that Utah State should absolutely be able to pass against. You got New Mexico, who's bottom 3 in the country versus the pass. You got Wyoming, who's 117th versus the pass. Some very, very good options moving forward. It's just a matter of who do we get moving forward, right? Because again, it could be simple, right? Where, White comes back, he takes over. Hestera's still out there as a rotational piece at slot when, they are, rotational piece of slot, when they're doing 4 wide and stuff like that. But also Hestera's done pretty well and outperformed White in a couple of key metrics, right? He's been more efficient with his catches. He's actually almost got more yards on the season than Kyrie's White does, even though Kyrie's White's got 8 more targets than him. And in addition to that, Hestera's actually been looked to more times during the end zone or during the red zone, right? So something tells me that there's a little bit of hinting that Hestera is just a pretty dang good option as well. But we're just going to have to see how this plays out. I'm hoping maybe they realize that they have 2 really good options here compared to, Otto Tia, who's been a drop machine for the Aggies so far. Sit him, put Kyrie's White out at, outside, maybe Hestera out at outside. Get both these guys on the field. Maybe both of them will be pretty solid moving forward. But for right now, I would take a shot on both Hestera and White. Keep an eye on Utah State news throughout the week. They're actually pretty good about keeping up with things, so you'll know pretty well in advance of who to target there. So, just to recap to this point in the season, again, our quarterback options off the waiver wire so far have been Mr. Parker Navarro and Tommy Ulatowski. We have, Savion Red, Ahmad Hardy, Trey Wisner, Elijah Gillum, and CJ Campbell off the waiver wire for running back. And then our 5 wide receivers have been Luke Floria, Aaron Anderson out of LSU, Matt Sykes out of Rice, and then Jordan Tyson out of Arizona State. And then we just finished up the 2 Utah State slot wide receivers. And you guys can get mad at me for recommending 2 guys and 1 basically there, but I'm telling you, like, if you get it right, it's gonna pay gangbusters down the line here. So, last but not least, let's head up I almost forgot our honorable mentions at wide receiver. Thank you, Graphics, for reminding me. Just a little reminder about some guys we talked about in the previous weeks. Again, Jackson Meeks, Jaden Williams, Dane Key. Meeks and Key themselves had some really, really good weeks this past week, right? You're looking at 14 targets, 11 catches, 116 yards, and a touchdown for Meeks. For Jaden Williams, or for Dane Key, excuse me. Key had himself another 10-target game, 83 yards, and a touchdown. Very solid performance there. And then Jaden Williams, I have him still up on the screen. It's just kind of a throw out there for, for getting a piece of that Texas State offense there. But this past week, he only had 2 targets for 35 yards, so I don't love that, obviously, but, given what he'd done the previous weeks, I'm not exceptionally worried about that. He'll get back on track here. And then Justin Lockhart, who just got done with another 9-target, 73-yard game there. Didn't find the end zone, but I think it's only a matter of time before he finds himself back in the end zone. So that being said, let's move on to my one tight end recommendation of the week, and that is Mr. Terrence Carter, the tight end out of Louisiana Lafayette. This past week, 6 targets, 4 catches, 170 yards, and a touchdown. Is Carter the quietest top 10 tight end season for CFF that we've ever really seen? Because, I didn't realize this until I was updating my stats, and then all of a sudden I saw Carter shoot way up. Now, granted, he had himself a 18-point performance this past week, right? But even still, he's not the flashiest of plays at tight end, but if you're kind of looking for a guaranteed non-zero at the position, right, I think he's one of the best bets you can find, right? Over the last 4 games, Carter's seen 6 targets in 3 of them. So subsequently, with those targets, putting up 60-plus yards in each of those. His best performance is the one I just discussed this past weekend against the likes of Appalachian State, where he caught 4 balls for 107 yards and a touchdown. Like I said, he's a guy that you can rely on. It's just, you're not going to really worry about him bottoming out on you each week. He leads the Raging Cajuns in targets, which is always a good role for a tight end in any offense, even if you don't trust that offense to score a whole bunch. That's the kind of tight ends that you want, just guys that'll get involved every single week because, they're clearly the top guy their quarterback's looking for. From a schedule standpoint, though, 2 of Louisiana's upcoming matchups in Coastal Carolina and Arkansas State may make for some really nice playable matchups. After that, you get Texas State's defensive performance or defense, but they're given how potent that Texas State offense is, it is going to force Louisiana to pass the ball a ton, which is obviously great for Carter, given the fact he leads the team in targets. So even if you don't find the end zone, the scoring opportunities are limited because of Texas State's defensive performance up until this point in the season. I think that you're still looking at a pretty solid week for a tight end, especially in a PPR format. So, no real honorable mentions. Just reminding you, Taylor Thompson, the tight end out of James Madison, still out there. He had himself a nice weekend this past weekend. 58 yards and a touchdown, 2 catches there. So a nice 12-point performance in half PPR formats there. But other than that, those are my tight end recommendations. Last but not least, let's head over and talk about some DST streaming options for this week. And I'll be real, y'all, I actually kind of like some of the options this week. I went back and looked at our Campus of Canton CFF guide. Just kind of, it's always a good place for me to kind of start in terms of looking for, just some obvious options, just to make sure I don't miss anything. And I'll be real, looking at it, this hasn't aged super well because, again, it's recommending teams like Middle Tennessee State. I mentioned them earlier. Their defense is absolutely atrocious. I don't care that they're playing Kennesaw State, who's one of the worst offenses in the country. They just gave up 5 touchdowns to freaking Louisiana Tech. So I'm not trusting that. Fresno State against Nevada, as we discussed over the last 2 weeks, Nevada's offense looks much better. It recommends Utah State. Utah State's defense is hot dookie, and New Mexico State's offense is actually pretty solid under Bronco Mendenhall. Tulsa might be a little interesting because I still don't love Temple's offense, but Temple can score, so that's out the window. And then Vanderbilt against Ball State, that actually might be a pretty solid play. I probably should have put that in here because Ball State's absolutely crapped the bed against any defense with a pulse here. So I think Vanderbilt's still a viable option against Ball State this weekend, but in terms of non-obvious matchups to try to take advantage of, I actually like some of the other options here. I got South Carolina going up against Oklahoma this week. They're rostered on 39% of leagues right now, so still available in quite a few of them. This really is picking on Oklahoma's offense. I would have liked this better if it was in South Carolina, but it's in Oklahoma, so that'll help Oklahoma's offense a little bit, that they're not dealing with the crowd noise. But again, Oklahoma's offense has been very, very bad to this point in the season. They're 123rd in the country on offense. Their offensive line is complete Swiss cheese, and that's a very unfortunate matchup for Oklahoma because South Carolina has, a really good secondary, so there's going to be some coverage stacks in there. And also, their just entire pass rush is ferocious. Currently, South Carolina is 10th in the country in sacks per game. So I think Oklahoma is going to struggle greatly this weekend. If they struggled against Texas's defense this past week, I think South Carolina's defense, which, again, according to our numbers, again, 13th best in the country, they should be able to shut down Oklahoma pretty easily. Wisconsin is another DST that I'm taking a look at this week. They're rostered on 37% of rosters. They are facing Northwestern this week. Again, picking on some bad offenses here, but also looking at some defenses that have really stepped up recently, right? Northwestern, they're 130th in the country on offense. They're averaging only 270 yards per game. Meanwhile, Wisconsin's defense has hit another level the last couple of weeks. They only allowed 6 points against Purdue, which, Purdue's had a pretty terrible offense up until this point in the season, but they also did just put up 49 points versus Illinois this past week. So maybe holding Purdue to 6 points wasn't the easiest thing in the world for Wisconsin. So credit to them on that. And then this past week, Rutgers, again, not the highest scoring offense in the world, right? But given their play style, but still to hold Rutgers and, Kyle Monangai down to 7 points, I think that, we're looking at a DST that's looking pretty solid. It also helps that, again, Wisconsin is 25th in the country when it comes to allowing yardage per game. So give me a very solid performing defense the last couple of weeks going up against a bad offense in Northwestern. I'm feeling pretty good about getting Wisconsin's DST in my lineups this week. Duke is another one we're taking advantage of, where they're going up against Florida State this week, rostered on 11% of leagues. So Duke is a very widely available one here. And again, we're picking on some bad offenses here. Florida State has not scored 21 points since week 1 against Georgia Tech. That should tell you everything you need to know about what you can kind of expect about Florida State moving forward. They have no identity on offense. They're getting absolutely wrecked. And Duke is, again, pretty solid on defense, similar to Wisconsin, 38th in the country in yards allowed per game. So I'm willing to take a shot on Duke there. Actually, let me see real quick. Is that game in Duke? I don't think it's the. Oh, it is at Duke, so that's another point in Duke's favor there. Again, not that Duke's home environment is like the most ferocious in the world or anything like that, but it is still home field advantage. Last one I'll talk about here is Rutgers, rostered on 16% of leagues. I'll fully admit on by the numbers, Rutgers is allowing 79th, in allowing yards per game, which is obviously not great. That's below average in the country, but they are facing UCLA's defense, who hasn't scored 17 plus points in a game so far this year. So another team that you're kind of taking advantage of the fact that you're not really expecting a ton of points to be put up on them. Plus, Rutgers runs the ball. It is a team that likes to shorten the games as much as possible. They're not really airing it out or anything like that. They don't score quickly. So another point in the favor of UCLA just not being able to really get much done on offense here. So I'm willing to roll out Rutgers' defense there. So with that, I've rambled on long enough. Guys, we come to the end of the show. Appreciate all of you guys for listening. If you guys have not already, just a quick reminder, leave a like, a comment, and subscribe if you're on the YouTube side of things. If you're on the podcast side of things, make sure you follow the show. Make sure you leave a 5-star review wherever you can. Make sure you guys check out the rest of the Campus to Canton podcast network for shows ranging on pretty much anything you can think of related to the college fantasy game. We'll see you guys back here on Wednesday with myself and Justin Leo for another round of your start-sit questions. By the way, go check out and make sure you're following the @ChasingTheNetty account. If you want your start-sit questions answered, you will find the tweet there. You can also drop them down below in the comments here on this YouTube video. I will try to incorporate some more YouTube start-sit questions moving forward. Until then, appreciate all of you guys for listening, and I hope you guys have a wonderful and blessed start to your week. See y'all.